Erica and Sharon are sisters who began their grief journey in 2006 when Erica's 10-year-old son Austin drowned. Together, they participated in a grief education program, were so moved by this experience, they studied and became specialists so they could help the brokenhearted find recovery. In 2015, tragedy struck their family once again when Erica's oldest son, Donovan, was killed in a motorcycle accident. Erica and Sharon are committed to sharing their experiences of love, loss, and healing through this podcast. Now your grief specialists, Sharon and Erica.
Hey, you know what's sitting at our dinner table right now? Trauma, PTSD, depression, anxiety, mental health. These are all the things we're talking about. Everybody's talking about them. Everybody's being diagnosed with them. Every griever we meet is coming in with their prescription that their doctor has given them. They've all been put into one of these neat, clean categories. We're all sitting at the table with the depressed person, the PTSD person, the trauma person. Do you know what's not at the table? The number one thing that needs to be seated at this table is grief. It's the griever. We have to start calling it out for what it truly is.
Well, grief is at the table. It's just being mislabeled. And it may be part of those other things, but it can also be, they can coexist at the same time. The trauma and grief, PTSD and grief, depression and grief. Those things can all coexist, but we absolutely need to add that to our invitee list, because Sharon, there has not been a time I have walked into a room with more than 3 people and some kind of way the conversation doesn't turn to grief. Absolutely. And it's me showing them how the situation is a grieving experience, and their eyes being so big because they don't even recognize it as that. And it's not that I'm trying to force people to believe they're grieving. That's not what I'm doing. I'm showing them how what they're feeling and the way that they're managing those emotions are the same as a griever experiencing a grieving event and then dealing with the active grief.
And part of the problem here, Erica, is that we only want to put the label of grief on death.
Right.
Only want to put the label of grief on death. And that we have got to stop doing. Grief is death. Grief is divorce. Grief is the breakup of a romantic relationship. Grief is living in the town where an active shooting takes place. Grief is knowing the active shooter. Grief is miscarriage. Grief is infertility. Grief is a feeling of not being happy or fulfilling. Grief is going through a traumatic event. You've gone through this traumatic event. You were at a town where there was an active shooting. It was traumatic. The response to that in your heart is grief. Depression, being depressed, having a grieving experience and feeling very sad and broken is also called grief. Being a griever and feeling anxious and feeling like you can't go outside, feeling like you have to take your Xanax with you everywhere you go or have a bottle of water with you everywhere you go is called grief. Grief needs a seat at the table. We can't just not talk about it. It's grief, my friends. It's what your heart is going through. Grief is an emotional experience to the loss that has occurred in your life.
And the 5 stages that are out there, those are not grief. Everyone wants to jump right into those 5 stages. The minute you say grief, it's 5 stages is right behind it. That's not how. There are stages. I would agree that there are stages, but they're not the ones laid out by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, which are for people who are dying. There are the fog, the shock and numbness. There are definitely stages, but they don't go in according to what's been laid out. And that is sad because we're doing a disservice to our grieving community by not showing up for them And like you said, giving grief the proper seat at the table, talking about all the things that go with the grief and how they can manage it and get to the point where you always say grieving and living.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. On the 5 stages, I want to throw this out. It was just a theory. Think about that, Erica.
Yeah.
It's a theory. It was a theory that was put with the dying person, which actually takes place in them, but somebody grabbed that and stuck it onto grief as a theory. I'm here to say, no, the theory didn't work. I should probably write a thesis on that. And really debunk it. Or maybe I should do a TED Talk. Oh, I did. Hey, here's the other thing that happens too. And you and I see this, and where grief really needs to take a seat at the table. Somebody has just had a grieving experience, and you and I go in, family member, friends. This has happened to me twice in the last month. And I ask, say, oh, how is so-and-so doing? Like they've just had a recent loss, a parent died, or a husband died. And right away, the other person that we're asking, doing the checkup on, thinks that you and I want to go into this deep grief conversation, or we're going to counsel them right there. They become so uncomfortable. Oh, they're fine. They're fine. I actually asked someone the other day, it was a young girl's father had just passed away and the parents are divorced. And I said, oh my gosh, how's she doing? Oh, fine. She'll be fine. Like I just get cut off. That's where grief is not at the table, my friends. When we can't even talk about the person's grief, where you can't even ask me a question, hey, what would be your advice? How can I show up for her? Or you just say, or you don't tell that lie that they're doing fine. Who loses their father or mother and is doing fine? She's really suffering. She's really crying. Or I haven't seen the grief show up yet. It's okay to talk about the grief. It's okay to talk about the grief. Grief needs to have a seat at the table. If you're having anxiety attacks and you can't go out your door, there's probably some grief involved there. If your doctor has just changed your depression medication for the 3rd time, I can guarantee you there's probably some depression there. If you're having PTSD, there's probably some grief in there, my friends. Let's just call it what it is.
I'm going to say something. We always say there's no judgment in this program, and we really, really mean that 1,000%. But when we get those responses of like, oh yeah, she's fine, we totally judge. You are not. Really? Because that's weird.
It's actually sad, Erica. It's really sad. Like I'll say, I asked so-and-so about their grief. And I think part of it is because people don't want to talk to us because they think we're going to take them down that path, or and honestly, we're just asking to be nice. And one thing is, you and I will use the word grief. We'll use the dead person's name. We'll use the divorced person's name. How's Sue doing since the divorce with Bob? We actually say their name out loud. How's Mary doing since her dad died? We say it out loud because we're not afraid of it. That freaks people out.
Yeah.
That really freaks people out and makes them feel uncomfortable. I joke about this, Erica, and when we say we have no friends, I joke about it. It's because of that situation. And the underlying thing is, as a society and as a human race, grief needs to come to the table. We need to allow grief to take a seat at the table, which, as you just said, is already sitting there, but ain't nobody talking to poor grief.
Yeah, exactly.
Nobody talking about poor grief. Ain't nobody talking about Mr.
Yeah, poor grief is in social isolation and just sitting there waiting to be acknowledged.
Yeah.
And everyone is talking around it and not to it. And that really is the biggest tragedy in all of this, because like I said, I can walk into a room and there any kind of way the conversation leads to grief, or even just watching my BS television shows. There's so much grief in reality TV. I can't even tell you. I like sitting there like, well, Sherry, I mean, you're mad Susan, because she didn't acknowledge that your feelings were hurt because your divorce just happened and you're going through the emotions. Like, I'm talking to the TV acting as though I'm trying to help them figure it out. But meanwhile, they're having this big old blowout because neither one of them is talking to the grief.
So, and that brings up a really good point about grief taking a seat at the table. We won't allow grief to take a seat at the table, but you texted me the other day, and one of the stories that you and I often share is about how when Austin died, we would be watching Grey's Anatomy a lot. And Chandra, girl, you must have some major grief. We need to talk about that.
I really need to talk about
anyway,
that.
What'd you say?
Really need to talk about that.
We need to talk to that girl. But anyway, here, sidetrack. How as a human race, we won't talk about grief, but grief really has a seat at the table. Ain't nobody talking to grief. Everybody's talking around grief. We're doing all the other things and talking around grief. Yet we will put it in every movie we've ever seen. Dumbo, E.T., Grey's Anatomy. Need I go on? Terms of Endearment, right? Steel Magnolias. We'll put the grief in a movie and allow the griever to go watch that movie and allow them to totally cry. But when grief is sitting at the table right in front of our face, we won't acknowledge it. But we allow it to be in the movies and the shows.
Yeah, that is so profound.
Yeah.
That is, yeah. It's everywhere. It's in every show, everything I watch. And I'm like, am I just weird? Because am I looking for it? But it's really there right in front of our faces. But we've been trained not to call it out and not to give it existence.
The other thing is, who would we be if we did allow grief to sit at the table? Who would we be as a humankind? Who would we be as people who were dealing with active grief, trauma, PTSD, depression, and anxiety? Who would we be?
We'd be so emotionally
less pills.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say we'd be so emotionally evolved because we wouldn't freak out if Sherry just busted out into tears because of her divorce. Yeah. We would just sit there and hold space for her. Yes. And not try to, girl, come on, let's go get a drink at happy hour. We wouldn't do that. Yeah. We would really hold space and let the emotion pass through her and be a comforting source for her.
I often will talk about the griever and use their name. When you're allowing grief to be at the table, it's absolutely okay to say the person's name. So a lot of times when people say, my son has just passed away, or my husband, we just got a divorce. I lost my baby. The first thing I say is, what was his name? What was her name? Just that alone is saying, come on in here. Come on, grief. And that is giving the griever the space to know that it's absolutely okay. You should see the griever's face change and their whole body language change, almost like they just want to melt down in front of us, right? They just want to dive right into my chest and put their head down and cry because I'm giving them permission. I'm saying that it's okay. I'm also allowing grief to be in our space. It's huge what happens when we hold the space for a griever and we allow that grief to be there.
Sharon, if you and I had $1 for every time we went to a function and someone walked up to us and said, oh, I gave Susie your phone number because she's got this loss. Oh, I gave Bob your phone number because he's got this loss. Grief is at the table. It's everywhere. It's every place we go. We're getting told that someone's been given our information because they've experienced some sort of loss. We know grief is going to happen, but we don't want to give it its due time.
Jamaica.
What?
If we had $1 every time that happened, I'd be living on the beach in Jamaica.
You went to Jamaica and there was grief.
Seriously, I'd have a big old mansion right on the beach. I'd still be doing grief work, but I'd be like walking out to the beach every day. And sitting on it, and I'd be meeting people. We'd be so rich.
Girl.
People give our phone numbers out all the time. And grievers never call us.
They don't.
Or people will give us the griever's phone number and say, hey, can you call Sue? Which
Yeah.
we never do. I'm never going to call Sue. So don't call me and give me her phone number. If Sue wants my work, give her my number. My number is listed. It's public. It's everywhere. Here's the deal, friends. We've got to start allowing the grief in. All of us. We got to talk about it. It's okay to talk about the grief. It's okay to say we're grieving. It's okay to say we're broken. It's even okay to say you don't know how to do this. Erica and I had to go find out how to do this. And we didn't just stop at one program. We've taken multiple programs. Every time there's a program out, we jump in it. We're at all of the programs. We're talking to all the grievers. We're finding out all the things. And here's the thing, grief is evolving as we as a humankind is evolving. But my friends, it's sitting at your table. Allow it in and be okay with it.
Give it the space it deserves and really let it pass through you. It's not going to kill you. It feels like it, but it's not going to kill you.
Thank you, friends. Thank you for joining us today. Want to let you know that we have an amazing Facebook group, and we would love for you to be a part of that group. We have a Facebook group for women who are grieving, and we show up in that group every week. We put training videos in there. We ask grief questions. We're building a community of women who are grieving, and we're grieving together. And we would love to have you join our group. The link is below. We look forward to seeing you on the next podcast.
Bye, friends. Thank you.